This is the Station for Negotiation podcast, episode number 58. My name is Gene Killian. I've been a lawyer and professional negotiator for 40 years. Some psychologists point out that we are mental misers. We often prefer the ease of hanging on to old views over the difficulty of grappling with new ones. Yet there are also deeper forces behind our resistance to rethinking. Questioning ourselves makes the world more unpredictable. It requires us to admit that the facts may have changed, that what was once right may now be wrong. Reconsidering something we believe deeply can threaten our identities, making it feel as if we're losing a part of ourselves. And that is a wonderful quote from a book that came out in 2021 named Think Again by Adam Grant. Adam Grant is an organizational psychologist at Wharton, and this book is all about questioning assumptions and communicating effectively with our colleagues, which, after all, is what we should be doing as negotiators. If you want to be a great negotiator, you have to constantly question assumptions, both your own assumptions and the assumptions being made by your negotiating partner. First of all, I highly recommend this book. I'm just going to barely scratch the surface during this brief talk. Grant has a very interesting way of looking at the world. He says in the book, citing another source, that we tend to fall into one of four modes of communication, and he defines them as preacher, prosecutor, politician, and scientist. And here's what Grant writes. He writes, "We go into preacher mode when our sacred beliefs are in jeopardy. We deliver sermons to protect and promote our ideals. We enter prosecutor mode when we recognize flaws in other people's reasoning. We marshal arguments to prove them wrong and win our case. We shift into politician mode when we're seeking to win over an audience. We campaign and lobby for the approval of our constituents." And so when we look at things this way, this is me talking again, not the book, we can see that the preacher mode, the prosecutor mode, and the politician mode aren't great modes for a negotiator or anytime you're trying to persuade someone to do something or to see something your way. Or I should say the correct way, not necessarily your way. People don't like being preached to. They just don't like it. And they don't like having their arguments disassembled piece by piece in prosecutor mode or being cross-examined. And I don't have to tell you what the popularity rating of politicians is, at least in the United States, pretty low. So what we're trying to avoid, I think, if you accept this construct, is not to behave like a preacher, a prosecutor, or a politician. So let's go to the fourth mode identified by Grant, scientist. And I think when you consider how a scientist views a problem, you will see that a scientist is focused exclusively on the objective data and solving the problem, as opposed to winning an argument with their colleagues. Here's what Grant writes. "Being a scientist is not just a profession, it's a frame of mind. It's a mode of thinking that differs from preaching, prosecuting, and politicking. We move into scientist mode when we're searching for the truth. We run experiments to test hypotheses and discover knowledge. Scientific thinking favors humility over pride, doubt over certainty, curiosity over closure. When we shift out of scientist mode, the rethinking cycle breaks down, giving way to an overconfidence cycle. If we're preaching, we can't see gaps." Thinking like a scientist involves more than just reacting with an open mind. It means being actively open-minded. It requires searching for reasons why we might be wrong, not for reasons why we must be right, and revising our views based on what we learn. Scientist takes the personal out of it. So this is me speaking again. This is Gene, not the book. When you're thinking like a scientist, you're focused only on facts and solutions with an extreme sense of curiosity. And when you form an opinion, you always ask yourself, what would have to happen to prove this opinion false? Going back to the book, here's what Grant writes. When you start forming an opinion, resist the temptation to preach, prosecute, or politic. Treat your emerging view as a hunch or a hypothesis and test it with data. Like the entrepreneurs who learn to approach their business strategies as experiments, you'll maintain the agility to pivot. So in Grant's writing, you can see that one of the main things we're looking for here to be better communicators and better negotiators is a sense of curiosity, constantly being curious, constantly probing what your main assumptions are and constantly probing what the other side's assumptions are. And there's an old saying that curiosity kills the cat. But actually, curiosity makes the cat much stronger. And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to make our way of looking at the world much stronger. And we're trying to take the personality out of it. You know, when I was reading this, I'm an old movie buff. And for some reason, I thought of a 1940 movie called The Fighting 69th, which is a Jimmy Cagney movie. It has James Cagney and Pat O'Brien in it. And it's a wonderful movie. It's a movie about redemption. So the idea is Jimmy Cagney plays this tough guy from New York. And, you know, he likes to get into street scraps, and he thinks he's going to go over and fight World War I as an American soldier and win a bunch of medals. But lo and behold, when he gets into the war, he discovers that he's a coward and he's afraid to fight. And eventually he is prosecuted for cowardice in the face of the enemy, and he's sentenced to death by a firing squad. And the night before he's supposed to be shot, there is a German attack on the compound where he's being held, and a big hole gets blown in the wall, and he's able to escape. But before he escapes, he has a conversation with the Catholic priest of the regiment, played, of course, by Pat O'Brien. What else would Pat O'Brien be playing but a priest? And he gets a little bit of a pep talk from Pat O'Brien, who says, you know, you have two ways to go now. I'm not going to stop you. You can either run away and maybe you'll get back to the United States and maybe the Army will forget about you, or you can run out and help your regiment, which is right now pinned down in a vicious battle. You can help them try to survive. And Jimmy Cagney first says, forget it. You know, of course I'm going to run away. You think I'm crazy to get involved in some battle? But then he has an epiphany. He has an epiphany through his conversation with Pat O'Brien, and he decides he's going to go try to help his regiment out. And he crawls into the battlefield, and in a shell hole while this battle is going on is his sergeant, played by Alan Hale, Sr. You might remember Alan Hale Jr. from the TV show Gilligan's Island. Well, his dad, Alan Hale Sr., who looked just like him, was also a terrific actor. And he and Jimmy Cagney did not get along, especially because of Cagney's cowardice in the face of the enemy. And Alan Hale is lying in this ditch while this battle is going on, and he's wounded. And Jimmy Cagney comes crawling up and finds him, and Alan Hale basically says to him, what are you doing up here with fighting men? Did you get lost again? And Jimmy Cagney looks at him and says, listen, I know what you think of me, and I know what I think of you, but never mind that. You'll get a belly full of our own private scrap later. You show me how to work this stovepipe, referring to a mortar that's sitting there. You show me how to work it so I can't miss. If you don't, I'll run you through with this bayonet. I think I have that speech correct. I didn't write it down, but I've seen the movie so many times. And of course, Alan Hale shows Jimmy Cagney how to work this mortar, and Jimmy Cagney becomes a hero. And I'm going to give you a spoiler alert. Jimmy Cagney actually jumps on a grenade to try to save Alan Hale when a German soldier throws a grenade into the ditch, and Jimmy Cagney does not survive the war. But what made me think about this was when Cagney says to Alan Hale, I know what you think of me and I know what I think of you, but never mind that. Let's focus on the problem at hand. Show me how to work this mortar so we can get our guys out of this. So when he said that, he took the personal out of the dispute and focused on the problem. Now, I went a long way for this. I understand it's because of my love of movies, but what I want to tell you is think like a scientist, focus on the problem, get the personality out of it. And when you focus on the problem, focus on attacking assumptions in a scientific way. And for this, I want to turn back to the book, Think Again. And there's a story that Grant writes about a young woman who interviews for a job, and she does it in a very interesting way. There's lots and lots of vignettes and discussions about specific negotiations and communications in this book. I'm just going to pick out one or two, and I really liked this one because it involves A, curiosity, and B, questioning assumptions. So let me go to this story. Let's see what we can learn from it. And here's what Grant writes. In 2014, a young woman named Michelle Hansen came across a job opening for a product manager at an investment company. She was excited about the position, but she wasn't qualified for it. She had no background in finance and lacked the required number of years of experience. If you were in her shoes and you decided to go for it, what would you say in your cover letter? Think about that for a minute. Here's what Grant writes. The natural starting point would be to emphasize your strengths and downplay your weaknesses. As Michael Scott deadpanned on The Office, I work too hard, I care too much, and sometimes I can be too invested in my job. But Michelle Hansen did the opposite, taking a page out of the George Costanza playbook on Seinfeld. My name is George, I'm unemployed, and I live with my parents. Rather than trying to hide her shortcomings, Michelle opened with them. I'm probably not the candidate you've been envisioning, her cover letter began. I don't have a decade of experience as a product manager, nor am I a certified financial planner. After establishing the drawbacks of her case, she emphasized a few reasons to hire her anyway. But what I do have are skills that can't be taught. I take ownership of projects far beyond my pay grade and what is in my defined scope of responsibilities. I don't wait for people to tell me what to do and go seek for myself what needs to be done. I invest myself deeply in my projects, and it shows in everything I do, from my projects at work to my projects that I undertake on my own time at night. I'm entrepreneurial. I get things done, and I know I would make an excellent right hand for the co-founder leading this project. I love breaking new ground and starting with a blank slate, and any of my previous bosses would be able to attest to these traits. A week later, a recruiter contacted her for a phone screen, and then she had another phone screen with the team. On the calls, she asked about experiments they'd run recently that had surprised them. The question itself surprised the team. They ended up talking about times when they were sure they were right, but were later proven wrong. Michelle got the job, thrived, and was promoted to lead product development. This success isn't unique to her. There's evidence that people are more interested in hiring candidates who acknowledge legitimate weaknesses as opposed to bragging or humble bragging. In other words, preaching. Even after recognizing that she was fighting an uphill battle, Michelle didn't go on defense or offense. She didn't preach her qualifications or prosecute the problems with the job description. By agreeing with the argument against her in her cover letter, She preempted knee-jerk rejection, demonstrating that she was self-aware enough to discern her shortcomings and secure enough to admit them. An informed audience is going to spot the holes in our case anyway. We might as well get credit for having the humility to look for them, the foresight to spot them, and the integrity to acknowledge them. Grant goes on to write, if we approach an argument as a war, there will be winners and losers. If we see it more as a dance, we can begin to choreograph a way forward. By considering the strongest version of an opponent's perspective and limiting our responses to our best few steps, we have a better chance of finding a rhythm. I love that. God, I love that. Instead of viewing an argument as a war, view any interaction you have as a dance. We're trying to choreograph a way forward. That's tremendous. And that is a great way to look at negotiation. Wonderful. So I want to go on to one more area that Grant talks about in the book. He talks about an astronaut at NASA named Ellen Ochoa. I want to talk about NASA right now because we just had, as I'm recording this, a remarkable expedition into outer space by Artemis II with a wonderful crew of 4 astronauts that got everybody to think about the possibilities of the human race if we work together, as opposed to our various ridiculous squabbles and grievances here on Earth. But Ellen Ochoa is a former astronaut and was the former director of the Johnson Space Center. And of course, she, as an astronaut back in the day, lived through the Challenger disaster and the Columbia disaster, 2 times when space missions ended in horrible tragedy. The problem is that they were having at NASA is because it's such a hard-driving, performance-based organization, people were afraid to take a step back and examine things scientifically, ironically, because they didn't want to be seen as someone who was dragging a project down. And here's what Grant writes about this. He says, in performance cultures, the emphasis on results often undermines psychological safety. When we see people get punished for failures and mistakes, we become worried about proving our competence and protecting our careers. We learn to engage in self-limiting behavior, biting our tongues rather than voicing questions and concerns. Sometimes that's due to power distance. We're afraid of challenging the big boss at the top. The pressure to conform to authority is real, and those who dare to deviate run the risk of backlash. A lack of psychological safety was a persistent problem at NASA. Before the Challenger launch, some engineers did raise red flags, but were silenced by managers. Others were ignored and ended up silencing themselves. After the Columbia launch, an engineer asked for clearer photographs to inspect the damage to the wing, but managers didn't supply them. In a critical meeting to evaluate the condition of the shuttle after takeoff, the engineer didn't speak up. About a month before that Columbia launch, Ellen Ochoa became the deputy director of flight crew operations. In 1993, Ellen had made history by becoming the first Latina in space. Now, the first flight she supported in a management role had ended in tragedy. After breaking the news to the space station crew and consoling the family members of the fallen astronauts, she was determined to figure out how she could personally help to prevent this kind of disaster from ever happening again. Ellen recognized that at NASA, their performance culture was eroding psychological safety. People pride themselves on their engineering expertise and excellence, she told me. They fear their expertise will be questioned in a way that's embarrassing to them. It's that basic fear of looking like a fool, asking questions that people just dismiss, or being told you don't know what you're talking about. To combat that problem and nudge the culture toward learning, Ellen Ochoa started carrying a 3x5 note card in her pocket with questions to ask about every launch and every important operational decision. Her list included the following questions. What leads you to that assumption? Why do you think it is correct? What might happen if it's wrong? What are the uncertainties in your analysis? I understand the advantages of your recommendation. What are the disadvantages? Let me stop there. Are those not wonderful questions to ask in a negotiation? If we're going to approach things like a scientist, if we're going to try to create an atmosphere in which we're engaging in a joint problem-solving exercise, even with an aggressive opponent, aren't these great questions? Your opponent says something and you say, what leads you to that assumption? What's it based on? Why do you think it's right? Hey, what might happen if the assumption's wrong? I understand you're certain about your analysis. Aren't there some uncertainties built in? I mean, what is the person going to say? No, there are no uncertainties at any level. If they do, they kind of lose credibility. And I love this question. I understand the advantages of what you're recommending. Let's think about the disadvantages. Grant writes, how do you know? It's a question we need to ask more often, both of ourselves and of others. The power lies in its frankness. It's non-judgmental, a straightforward expression of doubt and curiosity that doesn't put people on the defensive. Ellen Ochoa wasn't afraid to ask that question, but she was an astronaut with a doctorate in engineering, serving in a senior leadership role. For too many people in too many workplaces, the question feels like a bridge too far. Creating psychological safety is easier said than done. So I set about to learn how leaders can establish it. And Grant goes into a bunch of information here about how he pursues that topic. It's really, really interesting. But I want to come back to a discussion about Ellen Ochoa, because this goes into the fact that after the Columbia disaster, NASA had to look at a way to develop a stronger learning culture. And I want to talk to you about something that Grant writes about here because it's really important. And I think a lot of times we can get involved in a negotiation where there is a power differential and we are afraid to ask questions because we're afraid we'll look stupid. And you want to foster this idea of psychological safety in your mind and not be afraid to ask these questions. Because remember, if you ask a question and you don't get a proper answer or you're brushed off, at least you asked the question and you should follow up to try to get that information. But if you don't ask the question, you'll never know what could have been revealed. So never be afraid to ask questions in a negotiation. I want to go to the book here because it talks about some pressure that Ellen Ochoa felt in a particular circumstance. And here's what Adam Grant writes. The Columbia disaster reinforced the need for NASA to develop a stronger learning culture. On the next space shuttle flight, a problem surfaced with the sensors in an external engine tank. It reoccurred several more times over the next year and a half, but it didn't create any observable problems. In 2006, on the day of a countdown in Houston, the whole mission management team held a vote. There was overwhelming consensus that the launch should go forward. Only one outlier voted no. Ellen Ochoa. In the old performance culture, Ellen might have been afraid to vote against the launch. In the emerging learning culture, quote, it's not just that we're encouraged to speak up, it's our responsibility to speak up, close quote, she explains. Quote, inclusion at NASA is not only a way to increase innovation and engage employees, it directly affects safety, since people need to feel valued and respected in order to be comfortable speaking up, close quote. In the past, the onus would have been on Ochoa to prove that it was not safe to launch. Now, the onus was on the team to prove it was safe to launch. That meant approaching their expertise with more humility, their decision with more doubt, and their analysis with more curiosity about the causes and potential consequences of the problem. Let me take a step to the side here for a minute. This business about making people feel valued and respected in order to be comfortable speaking up. Think about ways you can foster that environment and that culture in any negotiation you're involved with. You want the other side to feel valued and respected. So they speak up, so they give you information, so they tell you what's really on their mind, which can help you address their concerns and get to a good and enforceable and sustainable resolution. Going back to the book, Grant writes, after the vote, Ellen received a call from the NASA administrator in Florida who expressed surprising interest in rethinking the majority opinion in the room. I'd like to understand your thinking, he told her. They went on to delay the launch. Some people weren't happy we didn't launch that day, Ellen reflects, but people did not come up to me and berate me in any way or make me feel bad. They didn't take it out on me personally. The following day, all the sensors worked properly, but NASA ended up delaying 3 more launches over the next few months due to intermittent sensor malfunctions. At that point, the manager of the shuttle program called for the team to stand down until they identified the root cause. Eventually, they figured out that the sensors were working fine. It was the cryogenic environment that was causing a faulty connection between the sensors and the computers. In 2018, when Ellen retired from NASA, a senior leader approached her to tell her how her vote to delay the launch in 2006 had affected him. Quote, I never said anything to you 12 years ago, he said, but it made me rethink how I approached launch days and whether I'm doing the right thing. Close quote. And Grant closes out this chapter by writing the following. We can't run experiments in the past. We can only imagine the counterfactual in the present. We can wonder whether the lives of 14 astronauts would have been saved if NASA had gone back to rethink the risks of O-ring failures and foam loss before it was too late. We can wonder why those events didn't make them as careful in reevaluating problems with spacesuits as they had become with space shuttles. In cultures of learning, we're not weighed down with as many of these questions, which means we can live with fewer regrets. It's a mistake to follow traditions because the status quo is familiar. We're better off questioning whether past routines are serving us well in the present and guiding us toward a better future. It's really a great way to put it. This whole business of creating a culture where people aren't afraid to ask questions. And as I just said a few minutes ago, isn't that what you're trying to do in a negotiation? Create a culture where the other side isn't afraid to speak to you? And you can't get there if you prosecute them, if you preach to them, if you politic them. You want to, again, and I'm beating a dead horse here, you want to create a joint problem-solving exercise. Let me give you an example from my own life. When I first graduated law school, I joined a firm in New York that prided itself on having all attorneys, partners, associates, everyone, vote on any important matter in firm governance or decisions to be made by the firm. And that was unique in law firms at the time. And it really required the partners to give away some of their power to associates like me who had just started with the firm. And it was basically a majority vote. And at one point, some matter came up for voting, and I forget what it was, but I felt pretty strongly that it was the wrong thing to do. I don't know why. And obviously I was, just out of law school. So what did I know? But I thought it was the wrong thing to do. And when I had started at this firm, several senior people at the firm had told me never to be afraid to vote my conscience. Don't be afraid to vote whatever you really think is the right thing to do in any of these meetings. So everybody in this meeting, probably 100 people, voted yes to this particular thing that senior management wanted to do. And I was the only person who voted no, which as I look back, might have been a little bit crazy to vote no after, a couple of months on the job against the senior leadership of this firm, but I voted no. And after I voted no, I was visited by several senior people at the firm asking me what the hell was wrong with me, basically. And I basically said, look, you guys told me to vote how I thought, what was right and what was wrong. I just didn't agree. But I have to tell you something. At that moment, I realized that my future was not with this firm. And it's not because of what they would do to me, because I was, a maverick on this one vote. It's because it kind of broke trust. I felt like they told me to do something. I did it. And now they're holding it against me. I ended up spending significant time with that firm. But I always felt like I'm not staying here. I got to move on. And eventually I did move on. Actually, I moved on. I came back and then I moved on again. But I knew my future was not with that firm. And it comes back to that. So you want to create a culture where people aren't afraid to say what's on their minds. You want to create a culture where people aren't afraid to ask questions and to question authority. And you want to create a culture where when you make a promise, you don't break it. Because if you say one thing and do another, you blow up your credibility. And that is the last thing a negotiator needs. It's the most damaging thing you can do to yourself in business. And so that's what I take, a couple lessons I take from this great book, Think Again. Listen, get the book. It's a wonderful book. It will really help you in your negotiation and communications. But just remember, try to avoid being a preacher, a prosecutor, or a politician, and focus on being a scientist, or on being Jimmy Cagney in the Fighting 69th after his moment of redemption. And folks, that's all I have for you today on the Station for Negotiation podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you'll get the book and enjoy that. And this is Gene Killian signing off and reminding you once again that negotiation is life. Hey, thanks for listening to the Station for Negotiation podcast. Until next time, you can keep up with us on social media at the following places. On X, formerly known as Twitter, it's at STN4Negotiation. That's at STN4Negotiation. On Facebook, you can hit us up at facebook.com/station4negotiation pod. That's facebook.com/station4negotiation pod. Over on Instagram, you can reach us at station4negotiation. Again, that's at station4negotiation. On LinkedIn, station4negotiation podcast. Again, that's station4negotiation podcast. Over on YouTube, we're at station4negotiation. That's at station4negotiation. If you want to shoot us an email, you can do that at station4negotiationpod@gmail.com. That's station4negotiationpod@gmail.com. So we'll see you next time on the Station for Negotiation podcast. And until then, remember, negotiation is life.